And welcome to Solitude. This is the podcast that is putting the oxygen back into the Christian life one soul at a time. And I'm so glad to be with you. And they were called the Desert Fathers, people who renounced the world and they lived their lives in the desert in contemplation of God. And though their way seems extreme to us in modern culture, especially Western culture, there are some absolutely invaluable lessons that they teach us even today that will help you if you're walking through a spiritual wilderness. And I'm talking about the Desert Fathers. And have you ever experienced, or maybe you're going through now, a desert experience, meaning that you feel abandoned, you feel alone, you feel like when you pray, your prayers bounce off the ceiling, and you just feel like even if you hang out with people, you still feel isolated because there's something driving this thing, there's something behind this thing. And often God will put us in a place, in a wilderness, without our choosing it, because he's trying to get our attention. And it is in the wilderness where we learn incredible things about God. So let me just say this about desert experiences. When I speak of desert, the desert, I'm also equating it with solitude. So the word solitude is very important. And when I say desert, I also mean solitude in this talk today, okay? So, but let me say this about the desert, that first of all, the desert or solitude holds priceless what the world deems valueless. There's an old famous saying that it has stuck with me since I was in college. And this saying is transformative to me and it's powerful. And it says this: in the desert, a bucket of gold is of much more value than a bucket of water. And think about that for a minute. If you had a bar of gold on one hand and a bucket of water on the other hand, and you're in the desert and it's 120 degrees, which one's going to have more value? Well, the water, right? Because you need water to survive. And there's something about the desert or the wilderness experiences that reset us, and they help us to see what is really important versus what the world deems important. And this is why solitude is priceless. When you are alone, especially, I'm giving a shout out to those of you who are extroverts, like my wife. I'm an introvert. It's easier for me to say this because I'm an introvert. But just as an introvert needs to get out and meet people and engage and be socialized and enjoy company, an extrovert needs solitude as well, because that's where we all, as human beings, learn how to reset, we learn how to refocus, and we learn how to hear God's voice. And the Desert Fathers believed that the desert was of the highest value precisely because the world thought it had no value. And this is why God brings us to places where we feel like there's no value in this, but God is doing something if you listen. If you quiet all the noise around you and listen. And the desert could not be exploited. Think about this for a minute. The desert could not be exploited or controlled or harvested. And so it had no value. And so when God puts us in solitude in a wilderness, he's getting our attention away from all of the overproduction and overbusyness that we're into. So think about why God chose Israel to go through the desert on their journey, and he chose the long route, right? 40 years instead of days or months, or however long it would take. It was not a shortcut, but it was the long way. Think about it. The desert was where Israel wandered for 40 years. Taught them one thing. It taught them that God is their provision in all things, even in the most barren, hopeless places. So in the desert, we learn what it means to really depend on God and how priceless God is versus my own strength and whatever the world can give me. And we learn how to love God in the hard places and how to stick with God in the hard places. But I say that to say this as well, that the desert or solitude can free us from distractions. And I say that because the world values constant noise and stimuli. Have you noticed that wherever you go, like when you shop, there's always music, like club music or something, and there's always this engagement going on. Like you have to see this, you have to hear this, you have to check this out, and you're always plugged in, you're always on, and there's always a new video to watch, a new podcast to check out, a new murder mystery to see. And it's hard to hear God's voice with all of these voices in your head and with your eyes so engaged all the time. So what does the desert do? What does solitude do? It strips us of all that stuff, and it quiets us and resets us so that we can learn to hear God's voice, and we can learn what it means to have faith and dependence on God. But I want to give you one more thing today on this, and that is this. The desert or solitude can be a place where Satan tries you. In other words, this is a place of testing. It's not a vacation. It's not a fun time. This is a challenge. When God gets your attention and he puts you in the wilderness, he wants to show you some things. And there will be a challenge. And Israel, think about Israel, Elijah, and Paul. And let me just pull that up real quick. You have Israel, Elijah, and Paul, right? And Jesus. And Israel, which is the children of Israel, they were tested in the desert for 40 years, right? Elijah was tested in the desert, his greatest test of his life, where he ran into the wilderness, it says, and he wished that he might die. He was running from an enemy who was trying to kill him. And then Paul the apostle, he was tested in the desert. And we don't know exactly what happened, but we know that he spent at least 3.5 years in the desert. And he was learning, I think, to know God and just to hear God's voice. Then Jesus was tempted or tested in the wilderness, right? This is the place where God tries you, and he strips you of all the stuff that you rely on, all the external things that are vain and have no meaning. And he wants to see what's really inside of you. He wants to see what's really there, if it's really legitimate, if it's real, if it has substance. So we have two choices when we come to that desert place. The first one is simply this. We can force it to work for us, right? You can force it to work for you. You can find a way to cope with the loneliness that was never transformed into solitude, which is healthy, right? You can find a way to cope by binge watching, by overeating, by drugs, by alcohol, by pornography, by anything to get you away from that feeling of being abandoned and alone. Or you could lean into it and say, God, speak to me. I want to hear your voice, right? But think about for a minute Vegas, right? What Vegas represents. Vegas represents the human will and their answer to take what is barren and what has no value, and they manipulate it to their purposes. And out of it comes shining cities filled with light and vice and anything you can imagine. And it's almost like a modern day Babel, where it says that they wanted to make a name for themselves. So that's one option, but here's the other option we can do today. We can surrender to God in our desert. You can surrender to God in your desert. In that desert place, God becomes all to us because there's nothing else we can lean on but him. So lean into it. Let God speak to you. Ask him to speak to you. Say, Lord, I want to hear your voice. If this podcast blessed you today, leave a comment and recommend it to a friend. And check us out on soul02.com, and also we're on YouTube and on Facebook. And we like doing these, and we like blessing people. So until next time, so glad to be with you. God bless you. And welcome to Soul 02. This is the podcast that is putting the oxygen back into the Christian life, one soul at a time.